There's a teacher at Holywell School, the school next door, who I like because she's an enthusiast. She's an enthusiast. She's enthusiastic about teaching. She's enthusiastic about her subjects. She's enthusiastic especially about music. Children who are at Holywell or used to be at Holywell, I wonder if you can guess who she is. Don't say now, because I think we shouldn't mention her name publicly. You can tell me afterwards your guess. And the last one was an especial clue that she's enthusiastic especially about music. That's good, isn't it, for a teacher to be enthusiastic? Fancy having a teacher who is competent and knows the subject, but he's just bored with it and he's just doing it for the money and no enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is good, but enthusiasm must have the right focus. It must have the right focus. Hitler was an enthusiast for hate. How dangerous that was. I heard of a retired couple who were enthusiasts for their seashell collection. Seashells. They poured their energies into collecting seashells. What happened to all their seashells when they died? I expect they just ended up in landfill. What a waste of life to be an enthusiast for seashells. The enthusiasm that's good for you, the enthusiasm that is a worthwhile use of life, is enthusiasm for Jesus. My aim this morning is to make us all enthusiasts for Jesus. We've been going through Mark's Gospel. Let's turn to Mark's Gospel again. Mark chapter 14 again. Let's turn to Mark 14. If you've got a church Bible, there's page numbers on the pink sheet, and it tells you where we're going with this. We've been going through Mark's Gospel. We found that chapters 8 to 13 have been about following Jesus the way of the cross. And Jesus has kept saying he's going to suffer, die and rise. And we need to follow him the way of suffering, dying to self and then later rising to glory. But now, as we get to chapter 14, he is actually about to suffer, die and rise. We've got a new section now, chapter 14, focusing around him suffering, dying and rising. But it begins with 2 meals. 2 meals to shape our understanding of and reaction to him suffering, dying and rising. So, we're in Mark chapter 14, verses 1 to 26, and I simply want to go through the 2 meals. That's the structure this morning. It's all structured around these 2 meals. Here's the first meal. Verses 1 and 2 set the scene. It's Passover time, when the Jews were especially feeling their Jewishness. They were full of religious fervour at this time of year. And they crowded into their capital city for the festival. And so Jerusalem went from 50,000 to 250,000 people, it's estimated. That's not a good time to kill Jesus. There's a lot of religious fervour and the city is packed and heaving with people. Not a good time to kill Jesus, but the religious leaders wanted to. And so they needed to find an inside man who could quietly, without the crowd knowing, lead them to Jesus so they could kill him. Would they find an inside man? Wait and see. In the meantime, Jesus goes to have a meal. Verse 3. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the house of a man known as Simon the leper. Clearly no longer a leper, otherwise no one could go in his house. But there's a meal happening. And at that meal, we see 3 reactions to Jesus. 3 reactions are shown to us. Let's go through them. First reaction, I'm going to call hot. The first reaction is hot. Verse 3 and verses 6 to 9. Now, before we look at that, imagine this. Imagine you are a young man at a restaurant. Some of you, that's easy. Some, it's less easy to imagine. But imagine you're a young man at a restaurant and a waiter comes to your table with a bottle of wine. And he says, the young lady over there asked me to give you this bottle of wine with her compliments. There it is, free to you with her compliments. Oh, what are you starting to think? And then what do? You eat your meal, and as you eat your meal, you drink the bottle of wine as well. And afterwards, you know what you find out? That bottle of wine cost £20,000. And that young lady over there is not a millionaire. She earns £20,000 a year. What are you thinking? Now, don't quibble and say you're not thinking anything sensible because you've just drunk a bottle of wine. That's a bit of a flaw in my illustration, right? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? She has just given you, and you've just drunk in one go, or rather quickly, £20,000, her whole year's wages. What are you thinking? Store that thought in your mind. Let's get into Mark 14. A woman comes into the room where Jesus is lying on a couch eating. That's the way they ate in those days, lying on a couch, at least the well-to-do people, with a table next to them. And this woman, she has a jar of perfume worth more than a year's wages. And she cracks it open and she pours it on Jesus' head. And the sweet smell fills the room. And the people around are in a state of shock. This is more extravagant than pouring out a £20,000 bottle of wine. At least you get to taste that. This is just perfume. This is just a nice or maybe slightly sickly smell around. Someone they don't even know has just barged into the meal and done that to Jesus. £20,000 poured out in a minute. What a moment's extravagant display. What's going on? What's it all about? Extravagant love. That's what it's all about. Extravagant love. That's what it's a display of. Here's someone who is effectively saying nothing is too much for Jesus. Nothing is too much for him. I wonder, what do you think is worth splashing out on? There's an older couple who live locally, don't go to this church, who I visited. They showed me their beautiful garden. They said, there's over £40,000 worth of plants in this garden. They'd splashed out on over £40,000 of plants and planted them in their garden. Because that's what they devoted their lives to. They said, this is our life really, our garden. And so they splashed out. What do you think is worth splashing out on? This woman thought Jesus was worth splashing out on. Nothing was too much. Nothing was too good to do for his honour. That's what she's saying. Are you like her? How much is too much to do for Jesus? Do you have an answer? Do you have, I do this, but that is too much for him? How far would you go for his honour? This far, but not that far? What would you give to promote his glory, his kingdom? This much, but not that much. What disapproval or unpopularity would you be willing to put up with for his sake? This woman is saying to us, nothing is too much to do for Jesus. Extravagant love. There's enthusiasm for you. By the way, who is this woman? What's her name? We're not told. We don't know. She's obscure. She's a nobody to their society. She's disapproved of. But her extravagant love for Jesus means he commends her. Is this an encouragement to you? Are you a nobody? Yes. Are you disapproved of by others? But verse 6, leave her alone, said Jesus. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. And Jesus will even make sure she's talked about across the world and across history. Verse 9. Verse 9, I tell you the truth, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. She'd never heard of Loughborough. Loughborough didn't exist then. She didn't know the world would last till 2023, and here we are hearing of her, because Jesus says, those who honour me, I will honour. Now, there's much more about this woman. I would love to look into what it means she's done it for his burial. There's an awful lot there, but we haven't got time. Let's move on from hot to the next reaction to Jesus, lukewarm. Lukewarm is verses 4 to 5. Others at the dinner table are quite aware how expensive such perfume is. A year's wages gone just like that? What a waste, they say. What emotionalism. What poor stewardship. If she really has that sort of money spare, instead of just pouring it out and it's gone in a minute, she could give it to the poor and it would do them good for years. What do you think of that? Seems pretty sensible to me. To be honest, I think they seem more sensible than her. Seems correct, doesn't it? I think they've got a good point, haven't they? But behind their reaction is the attitude. You are being over-enthusiastic. Calm down, woman. You're going over the top about Jesus. This is OTT. Children, do you know OTT? Over the top. But that's exactly where they're wrong. There is no such thing as OTT about Jesus. You can't be over the top about him. I'll give you some parallels, I would suggest. Some people have got their arms in the air singing praise and they're looking ecstatic. And you think to yourself, hey, don't you know, in the Bible, arms in the air is for praying, not singing. You're incorrect. And it's just all a bit showy. Just over-emotional. Someone else in their conversation talks about the Lord in glowing terms and relates their experience to his love and care. And you think, that's a bit super spiritual. You're just all a bit gushy, aren't you? Now, what's going on there? Aren't such reactions usually being defensive? Aren't such reactions usually defensive? Finding fault with others, and you might even be correct in some of the fault you're finding, but you're finding fault with others because they show up, we're not that enthusiastic for Jesus. We've got to be defensive because they show up. I haven't got their enthusiasm, so I better find a fault with them. Be careful not to be the verse 4 and 5 people, lukewarm. Next reaction, it gets worse, cold. Or is lukewarm, which is worse, lukewarm or cold? Some of you might know what Jesus said about lukewarm people and vomiting them out of his mouth. But anyway, here's cold, verse 10 and 11. Verse 10 and 11. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Right, the chief priests have got their inside man. Did you notice the question was raised, would they, in verse 1 and 2? They've got him, verse 10 and 11. He can lead them to Jesus without stirring up the crowd. What a horrible thing Judas is going to do. Even in our biblically illiterate society, it is still an insult to call someone a Judas because it's a horrible thing to do. Does he have any relevance to us? We better be careful here. Have a look how Judas is described. Verse 10. Verse 10, then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12. Then look at verse 20. Verse 20, it is one of the 12, Jesus replied, when saying who will betray him. Then look at verse 43. Just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. Why does Mark keep saying he's one of the 12? He's saying he's one of the top dogs, he is. He's in the inner circle. He's the equivalent of an elder of the church. He's gone around preaching about Jesus and performing miracles. None of the disciples ever suspected him of being rotten at the core. He's been with Jesus for 3 years. And at first he thought Jesus fitted his agenda. You see, Judas's agenda was power and money. That's what he's interested in, power and money. And he thought Jesus would be a route to him getting power and money. But now he finds, well, what has Jesus been teaching across chapters 8 to 13? He's not the route to power and money. He says, I'm going to lead you the way of the cross. My way is one of denying self. And now he even lets a woman spend a year's worth of wages and it just goes in a minute. Because Jesus isn't interested in money. He commends a woman who sort of splashes out the money. Verse 10, Judas, he wants money. Verse 11, he's offered money. So Jesus doesn't fit his agenda. And once Jesus doesn't fit his agenda, Judas will sell him. He no longer wants him. What about you? Could there be a parallel? Do you regard Jesus as a route to your agenda? You want a fulfilled life, and you hear Jesus will get you a fulfilled life. You want a successful life? Maybe Jesus can get you a successful life. But if things don't seem to be going your way with Jesus, he can go. Or is Jesus someone who can sit alongside your agenda? You know, you'll get a comfortable life, you'll get all those nice middle class things, and you can have a bit of Jesus on the side, that he keeps on the side. Or does Jesus set your agenda? Are you like the woman, hot? Are you like the other guests, lukewarm? Are you like Judas, cold? Now, we're about to move into the second meal, but before we do, I want to try to link them. Because you might see ways you are like Judas or the lukewarm dinner guests. You might realise, actually, I'm a long way off that loving woman with her enthusiasm. And you might be thinking, what can be done about that? And it could seem I'm just telling you, come on, stir yourself up, get enthusiastic, pull up your bootlaces and drum up some enthusiasm. Sort yourself out and serve Jesus. But we must remember what is possibly the theme verse of Mark's Gospel. Do you know what's possibly the theme verse of Mark's Gospel? It's chapter 10, verse 45. You might like to turn back and have a look. Chapter 10, verse 45 must always be kept in mind with Mark. Chapter 10, verse 45. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus didn't come for us to serve him, he came to serve us. So the message from the meal can't just be, come on, get on and serve Jesus. We're going to find in the second meal, Jesus serving us. He came to serve us, and he's going to demonstrate it. To put it another way, why was this woman an enthusiast for Jesus? Where did her extravagant love come from? Well, the answer is shown in the second meal, because the second meal displays a more extravagant love. A more extravagant love is the love of Jesus for us. So, let's get into the second meal. So this is verses 12 to 26. Again, we're told it's Passover time. And Jesus has a strange plan for his disciples finding the room where they'll hold their festival meal. Jesus doesn't tell them, go to such and such street and find the third house along. He says, go and find a man carrying a jar of water, which was very unusual in their society. Women carried jars on their heads. Follow him, and he'll lead you to the place. It sounds like a spy film or a Tintin story. Why is Jesus doing this? Because he doesn't want to say in front of the disciples where it's going to be, because he doesn't want Judas to know, because he doesn't want the priests breaking in and breaking up his last time with his disciples. Notice Jesus wasn't trying, he knew what was going on, he wasn't trying to avoid death, but he wanted to be in control of when. And he wanted this time with the disciples he loved. He had more to teach them. So, that evening they arrive, verse 17. And they recline on couches around a table. Think of like a star shape, table in the middle and couches going out from it. And they recline on these couches. The disciples who were there earlier have roasted a lamb. And they've set out on the table unleavened bread and bitter herbs and stewed fruit and wine. And as they lie on their couches, they eat and they drink and they talk together. But this isn't just a social meal. It is a social meal, but it isn't just a social meal. It's the Passover, an annual meal for Jewish people to remember God rescuing their ancestors from slavery in Egypt. And all that food and drink that I've just described had significance to them. It was symbolic of what God did back then. And so there comes a point in the meal where the leader of the meal, he's got a certain job to do. And Jesus did it. He sat up on his couch and he took the bread. And he prayed a prayer of blessing. And he broke the bread to pass it round. And all the disciples expect him to do what happens next at the Passover. What happens next? The leader of the meal talks about how this symbolises what God did back in history. The great rescue God did of the Israelites from Egypt, symbolised by this meal. But Jesus doesn't. You look for that in the passage and it's not there. He doesn't. What does he do? He says, this is all about me. This represents me. What's going on? What a claim. And then they've eaten the bread. He gets the cup ready to pass it round. Now is the time to remember God's covenant. This cup is the time to remember those Old Testament sacrifices and how, fancy this children, the people were sprayed with the blood of the animal. And it was all about making a covenant. God committing himself to relationship with his people. Now's the time to talk about that, but Jesus doesn't. You look through the passage, it's not there. What does Jesus do? He says, this also is all about me. I am bringing in a new covenant. What's Jesus doing? Let's think about another meal, a wedding reception. Been to a wedding? Children, have you been to a wedding? And the wedding service has happened, and then the photos, which seem to take hours and hours, they've happened as well, and now it's time for food, you think. And you go out of the building, there's someone at the door, and he gives you a packet. It's an astronaut's meal. There's a tube of squishy stuff, and there's a few tablets, and apparently that's all the nutrition you need. Eat it in your car on the way home on your own. Is that a good wedding reception? Well, you've got all the nutrition you need. But you know, don't you, that a wedding reception, a meal, isn't just about how much food can you get in your body. A wedding meal is supposed to mean something about love and togetherness and celebration. Jesus in this meal, he's doing more than just giving his friends food. It's got a meaning about love and togetherness and celebrating what Jesus will do. Jesus, in fact, is acting out Mark 10, verse 45. Do you remember it? Mark 10:45. I'll tell you again. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. There's greatness. Jesus says, I'm the Son of Man. If you know the book of Daniel, the Son of Man is this great figure who rules the universe. And Jesus says, I'm him. It's a claim to greatness. And Jesus in the Lord's Supper, he says, look how great I am. This festival you've been doing for centuries is all about me. But the Son of Man came to serve. And Jesus is here demonstrating, I am the Son of Man, but I've come to serve. And the way I will serve is by giving my life for others. He's acting out Mark 10, verse 45. The meal is all acting out how Jesus will serve by giving his life. Let me show you some of the ways. Jesus, by his word, says, I'm like the Passover lamb. I'm going to die in the place of others so their sin is passed over. And then by his actions, he demonstrates as he breaks the bread, this is going to happen by my body being broken. As nails are driven in, as a whip is drawn down my back, as thorns are pushed on my head. It's all going to happen by my body being broken. Jesus, by his actions by his word says, God is bringing in a new covenant. God is binding himself into relationship with people. People who are sinners, but he's going to forgive them. People who can't make themselves loving, but he's going to put his Spirit in them so they become like that woman, hot with extravagant love. And by Jesus' actions, he pours out the wine. By his actions, he says, this covenant is going to happen by my blood being poured out on an execution ground. At which meal is more extravagant love on display? First meal or second meal? At which meal is more extravagant love on display? The woman gives a year's worth of money. Jesus gives his life and his body. The woman pours out expensive perfume. Jesus pours out his blood. There's extravagant love. Now, have I told you anything new? Maybe for some of you this is new and you didn't know. God the Son came out of extravagant love and poured himself out. I hope you're amazed. Are you amazed by it? Maybe it is new to you, but maybe it's not new. Most of us knew it already, didn't we? We knew it. That Jesus dies, that he does this so we can be forgiven, so God can bind himself into committed relationship. We knew it already. But Jesus also tells us, don't just know it. Don't even just agree with it. What does he tell us to do? Verse 22. Verse 22, he tells us, do something more. Verse 22, while they were eating, Jesus took bread, gave thanks and broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, take it. Take it, this is my body. Then he took the cup, gave thanks and offered it to them, and they all drank from it. Remember, this isn't just food. It's not he's magically changed it into something. I hope you realise that. The nonsense some churches teach that the bread and wine has magically turned into something is just nonsense. And dangerous nonsense. No, but it is symbolising, it is representing something more. Jesus is acting out the gospel. He's acting out the gospel. And he's saying, you must take Jesus. You must take hold of him. You may know about Jesus. You may even agree with what you hear about Jesus. Many of us, we've known about Jesus for years and years and years, and we've heard about him Sunday by Sunday. But have you actually taken Jesus? That's the question I want you to answer to yourself now. Have you actually taken Jesus? Oh, you say, what do you mean taken Jesus? Well, have you actually said to Jesus, I need you. I need to belong to you. I need you at work in me. I need to be one of your disciples. Have you actually said that to him? Have you even said to yourself, I'm going to trust Jesus. I'm going to trust him now for life and forever. No more putting it off. No more saying, I will one day when I'm older, when I've got this or that sorted out. What about now? Will you not just know about him, not just agree about him, but will you take hold of him? Please, will you answer that to yourself now? Will you take him? And then surely you can't be like Judas, cold. Surely you can't be like the other guest, lukewarm. Surely you must be like that woman, hot with enthusiasm and extravagant love for Jesus.